The scream was always the same. Sarah woke up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding against her ribs. 3 years after tragedy, the nightmare remained as vivid as the first day. It was 4:37 a.m. In a few hours, she would be at the Thompson mansion for an interview, an opportunity she couldn't afford to lose, even as her instincts whispered warnings. The mansion emerged from the morning mist like a ghost. Built on the highest point of the city, its Gothic towers and windows seemed to judge everything around them. The taxi stopped, and Sarah paid with the last of her savings. "Are you sure you want to stay here, miss?" The driver hesitated. "People say this house." "I just need the job," Sarah replied, forcing a smile. The Thompsons had posted the ad 2 days ago, a private nurse to care for a young man in a vegetative state. The salary was 3 times higher than anything Sarah could earn at a public hospital, enough to pay off the debts she had carried since David's death. Martha, a middle-aged housekeeper, greeted her at the door. "Miss Miller, follow me, please." The interior was even more impressive. Polished marble, fine wood, and artwork worth more than everything Sarah owned. The silence felt almost sacred. "The family is in the library," Martha explained. "Young Josh had an accident 8 months ago. He can hear, but doesn't respond to stimuli. Discretion is essential within these walls." In the library, Sarah felt scrutinized by piercing gazes. Richard Thompson, an imposing man in his 50s, stood by the fireplace. Elizabeth, his wife, exuded a cold beauty from the leather sofa. "Miss Miller," Richard's voice was deep, "your resume is impressive. Thank you. I have experience with patients similar to your son." A quick glance passed between the couple before he continued. Josh was brilliant. He was going to inherit all of this. He gestured to the mansion. The accident changed everything. Elizabeth stood up. "Shall we meet him?" Josh's room was isolated in the east wing. A nurse with dark circles under her eyes left as they arrived. The space was equipped with state-of-the-art medical devices. Josh was 16, but in the hospital bed, he looked like a child. His thin body remained still, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "He was so full of life," Elizabeth murmured, her voice wavering. "The adjacent room will be yours," Richard interrupted. "We need someone full-time, day and night." Sarah approached, examining the medications, records, and notes. "May I?" she asked, reaching out to touch Josh's forehead. Something strange happened at that moment. A tremor ran through the boy's body, and his vacant eyes seemed to focus on hers for a fleeting moment, with unsettling intensity. "Is he under medication that induces a coma?" she asked, turning to Richard, who stiffened. "Why do you ask?" His pupils reacted to my touch. That's uncommon in deep vegetative states. A heavy silence fell over the room. Elizabeth shot a quick look at her husband. "Josh has moments of partial awareness," Richard explained formally. "They're reflexes that don't indicate real improvement. We've consulted specialists." "When do I start?" Sarah asked. "Immediately if possible," Richard replied. "Martha will show you the facilities." When she was finally alone with Josh, Sarah leaned over him. "Hello, Josh. I'm Sarah, your new nurse." As she organized the medications, a strange sensation sent chills down her spine. She turned abruptly and was certain Josh was watching her through half-closed eyes. A single tear slid down his motionless face. In the hallway, Sarah caught fragments of a heated argument between Richard and Elizabeth. Only one phrase from Elizabeth was clearly audible. "What if she finds out? What if everyone finds out?" The silence that followed was more disturbing than any answer. Sarah closed the door and looked at Josh, her heart racing. What was there to discover? Why did she feel that the boy's silence wasn't just the consequence of an accident, but a scream muffled by something far darker? The first week of the Thompson mansion passed in a blur of meticulous routines and silent observations. Sarah quickly learned that the thick walls of the mansion held more than just luxury and privilege. They harbored layers of carefully cultivated silence. Each morning followed the same pattern: bathing Josh, changing the sheets, checking his vitals, administering medication. The previous nurse had left a detailed protocol, with precise schedules for each drug. Something about the regimen deeply unsettled Sarah. Why so many sedatives for a patient in a vegetative state? She asked Dr. Phillips, the family doctor who visited Josh twice a week. The doctor adjusted his glasses uncomfortably. Young Thompson has episodes of agitation, occasional seizures. The sedatives prevent additional neurological damage. His explanation sounded reasonable, but his eyes persistently avoided hers, feeding her suspicions. On the third night, something woke Sarah from her light sleep. A faint sound, almost imperceptible, coming from Josh's room. She found him exactly as she had left him, motionless, shallow breathing, eyes half open. But something was different. His fingers moved slightly, as if trying to reach for something. "Josh?" she whispered, approaching. "Can you hear me?" The movement ceased instantly. Sarah sat beside the bed, her heart pounding. "If you can understand me, blink once." The seconds dragged in absolute silence. Then, almost imperceptibly, Josh's eyelids trembled and closed for a brief moment. "My God," Sarah murmured, a chill running down her spine. "You're in there." That same night, while Josh finally slept, Sarah meticulously examined his medical records. The accident had occurred during a boat trip. Josh had fallen and hit his head. Apparently simple, except for subtle inconsistencies in the reports. In some documents, Richard was alone with his son. In others, Elizabeth was also present. In a third, vague mentions of family members appeared. The next morning, as she went down for breakfast, Sarah found Martha arranging flowers in the entrance hall. The housekeeper had worked for the Thompsons for over 20 years. Perhaps she knew more than she let on. "Martha, were you here when Josh had the accident?" The housekeeper's wrinkled hands paused for a moment. "I've been in this house so long that sometimes I feel like the furniture, dear. I see too much, I hear too much." "And what did you see about the accident?" Martha glanced around before answering, her voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't on the boat. That's all I can say. And after that day, Mrs. Meredith was never seen again." "Meredith?" The housekeeper paled, as if she had said more than she intended. "Forget that name, for your own good." That afternoon, while feeding Josh a soft soup, Sarah noticed something on the highest shelf of the cabinet. A carved wooden box. Inside, she found old photographs. A young, beautiful woman smiled, holding a much healthier-looking Josh. On the back of one photo, a single word written in elegant handwriting: "Mom." The resemblance between Josh and the woman was undeniable. The same amber eyes, the same face shape. But Josh had none of Elizabeth's features. Not a single one. "Who is she, Josh?" Sarah asked, showing him the photo. "Is this Meredith? Is she your real mother?" Josh's eyes filled with tears that silently rolled down his pale face. Sarah felt her heart tighten. "I'm going to help you," she promised, holding the young man's fragile hand. "I'll find out the truth." That night, an envelope was slipped under her bedroom door. Inside, an aged newspaper clipping bore a small headline: "Financial empire heiress committed to psychiatric clinic after nervous breakdown." The photo showed Meredith, looking much more worn, being escorted into a car. The date, exactly 1 week after Josh's supposed accident. Sarah felt the weight of the truth beginning to unfold. This wasn't just a case of an injured boy. It was a carefully woven web of lies involving money, power, and possibly something far more sinister. The next day, while helping Josh with his passive physical therapy, Sarah noticed he was trying to communicate something. His fingers moved rhythmically against the bedsheet. "Are you trying to tell me something, Josh?" The fingers continued their movement. With a jolt, Sarah realized it wasn't random. It was Morse code. Her brother had taught her as a child. Focusing on the subtle movements, She translated a message that would change everything. ITWSNODNACCENT. It was not an accident. Josh's words pulsed in Sarah's mind like a wounded heart. Sitting on the edge of her bed that night, hands trembling as she held Meredith's photograph, she felt the weight of the truth unfolding like an ancient map, full of dangerous territories and hidden borders. The sunrise brought a silent determination. If Josh was conscious, trapped in his own body, while those who should have protected him kept him sedated, every minute mattered. During breakfast, Sarah watched Richard and Elizabeth, their polished smiles now looking like fragile masks covering something sinister. "I was thinking about adjusting Josh's medication schedule," Sarah commented casually, spreading jam on her toast. Some of the sedatives seem excessive for his current condition. Elizabeth's fork stopped in midair. Richard lowered his newspaper, his penetrating gaze meeting Sarah's. Dr. Phillips established his protocol for a reason. He responded with studied calm. "Josh has violent episodes when the medication is reduced. Believe me, we've tried." Sarah nodded, noting how Elizabeth's fingers tightened around her teacup with enough force to crack the fine porcelain. Later, alone with Josh, Sarah established a simple communication system. 1 tap for yes, 2 for no. Slowly, like someone piecing together a puzzle with scattered fragments, she began to connect the dots. "Is Richard your biological father?" 1 tap, yes. "Is Meredith your real mother?" 1 tap, yes. "Is Elizabeth your stepmother?" 1 tap, yes. "Did they do this to you?" 1 tap, yes. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to contain the horror growing inside her. A 16-year-old boy, held prisoner in his own body by the very people who were supposed to love him. "I'm going to get you out of here," she whispered, holding Josh's frail hand. His fingers gently squeezed hers, a barely perceptible gesture carrying the weight of desperate hope. That afternoon, while the mansion was relatively quiet, Sarah decided to investigate. The Thompsons' library seemed like a good place to start. People hide secrets in books, drawers, among papers they believe no one will ever examine. Among meticulously organized files, Sarah found documents from the family business, Thompson Enterprises. Richard had taken control after the death of his older brother, William, Josh's father. Papers showed that William had planned to divide the company, selling significant parts to competitors. Richard, apparently, had other ideas. A brown envelope contained what appeared to be a draft of a will. William left everything to Josh, with Meredith as a trustee until he came of age. If anything happened to both of them, the trustee would be Meredith's sister, Claire. Richard's name appeared nowhere. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made Sarah quickly hide the documents. Martha appeared at the door, her gaze heavy with concern. "Did you find what you were looking for, dear?" the elderly woman asked, her voice betraying an unusual nervousness. "Just admiring the book collection," Sarah replied with a forced smile. Martha closed the door behind her and approached, speaking in a near whisper. "William died in a car accident. Meredith was in the passenger seat. She survived but was never the same again. She said it wasn't an accident, that she saw Richard sabotaging the car. No one believed her, of course. And Josh, he witnessed everything. The boy was hiding in the back seat, waiting to surprise his father. After that, he started asking questions. Too many questions." Martha swallowed hard. "Then came the accident on the boat." A noise in the hallway made the housekeeper quickly step back, pretending to adjust some books. The door opened, revealing Elizabeth, her tense smile stretched across her lips. "Sarah, dear, I was looking for you. We have guests for dinner tonight, and I'd like Josh to be presentable. Could you help him get ready?" In the bedroom, as she carefully combed Josh's hair, Sarah noticed something she had overlooked before. A small, recent surgical scar behind his left ear. It wasn't documented in any of his medical records. "What did they do to you?" she murmured, gently touching the mark. She didn't expect a response, but when her eyes met Josh's in the mirror's reflection, she saw silent tears running down his face. His lips moved imperceptibly, forming a single word that Sarah managed to read. Doctor. The revelation hit her like ice water. Dr. Phillips. The same doctor who insisted on keeping Josh sedated. The same one who signed all the medical reports. The family's physician for decades. That night, the much-anticipated dinner took place. Dr. Phillips was among the guests, chatting animatedly with Richard. Sarah observed them, noting the intimacy of men who share more than professional relationship. They shared secrets. When the doctor saw her, his smile faltered for a brief moment. "How is our patient?" he asked, his voice falsely cordial. "Stable," Sarah replied, keeping her expression neutral. Although I noticed some interesting reactions today. A tense silence settled over the small group. Richard placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder, his fingers pressing with unnecessary force. "Dr. Phillips and I have matters to discuss. If you'll excuse us." As the two moved away, Sarah felt a light touch on her arm. An elderly woman with intense green eyes smiled at her. "You must be the new nurse," the woman said. "I'm Claire, Josh's aunt." Claire Thompson had that discreet presence that could go unnoticed, but face to face with Sarah, she radiated a silent strength that was impossible to ignore. Her green eyes, identical to Josh's, carried the same pain Sarah had seen in the boy's gaze. "I visit him every month," Claire said, delicately holding her glass. "Richard only allows visits by appointment, always supervised. It's the best I can negotiate." Negotiate? Sarah kept her voice low, aware of Elizabeth's watchful eyes from across the room. "The agreement that lets me see my nephew without ending up like my sister." Committed, declared mentally unstable. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. The confirmation of her suspicions made the puzzle pieces fit into even darker shapes. "Meredith is alive," Claire continued, her fingers tightening around the glass. "Confined in a private clinic. For years, I've tried to get her out, but Dr. Phillips' signatures are indisputable in court." The pieces were coming together. Richard had eliminated his brother, silenced his sister-in-law, and now kept his nephew, the true heir, in a state of induced paralysis. "I need your help," Sarah whispered. "Josh is conscious. He communicates with me." Claire's eyes shone with restrained tears and a glimmer of hope. "My God, I always knew. I always felt he was in there. He told me it wasn't an accident. I found documents suggesting Richard took over the company after his brother's death. Josh has a recent surgical scar that isn't in any medical record." Claire leaned discreetly against a nearby table. William was about to sell part of the company. Richard was against it. Meredith started suspecting him. Then came the car accident. Her voice broke. Josh was in the car, hiding. He saw everything. Sarah felt her heart tighten. A boy witnessing his own father's death, carrying that secret for years, until he started asking questions. Sarah completed. Claire nodded. Richard and Dr. Phillips have been friends for decades. When Josh became ill, no one questioned the diagnosis. Their conversation was interrupted when Dr. Phillips approached with a forced smile. Claire stepped away, but not before slipping something into Sarah's hand. A small card with a phone number. That night, Sarah entered Josh's room and slightly reduced the sedative dose, enough to increase his awareness without alarming the doctors. "Josh, I met your Aunt Claire. She's going to help us. We're getting you out of here." Josh's fingers gently squeezed hers, a silent yes that spoke louder than 1,000 words. "Your mother is alive, in a clinic. Claire is trying to free her." 2 tears slid down Josh's pale face. A surge of fierce protectiveness swelled inside Sarah. The time for silence was over. The following morning carried a different weight. Sarah watched as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains in Josh's room while adjusting his floor, her hands moving with the familiarity of someone who had memorized every detail of that space. The plan was set, but fear, a silent companion that had settled in her chest since her conversation with Claire, refused to leave her. "Good morning, Josh," she whispered, leaning in to check his vitals. Today is going to be different. Josh's eyes opened slowly, more alert than usual thanks to the gradual reduction of his medication. Sarah saw something in them she hadn't noticed before. Not just awareness, but a silent determination that mirrored her own. The mansion's doorbell rang in the distance. Sarah tensed, knowing exactly who had arrived. Dr. Phillips, summoned by Elizabeth to adjust Josh's medication. Time was running out. Half an hour later, footsteps echoed down the hallway, the doctor's familiar stride, followed by Elizabeth's sharp heels. Sarah positioned herself protectively beside Josh's bed. "Sarah, dear," Elizabeth's voice was too sweet. "Dr. Phillips is here to examine Josh. Would you mind giving us some privacy?" The doctor entered, his presence filling the room with a practiced authority. His eyes quickly scanned the medications on the forestand, noticing the subtle adjustments Sarah had made. A barely perceptible frown crossed his face. "I see some modifications have been made to his medication," he noted, his tone deceptively casual. "Yes, doctor," Sarah replied firmly. Josh seemed uncomfortable with the previous dosage. "I followed standard protocol for cases of discomfort." "I see." The doctor smiled, but the expression never reached his eyes. "Perhaps we should return to the original dosage. I've known Josh for a long time. I know what's best for him." Sarah's heart pounded, but she maintained her composure. "Of course, doctor. But before we do that, I'd like to show you something I noticed." She stepped closer to Josh and gently tilted his head, revealing the small scar behind his ear. "This surgical mark isn't listed in any of his records. Could you explain it?" A heavy silence settled over the room. Elizabeth and the doctor exchanged a quick glance, a wordless conversation confirming all of Sarah's suspicions. It was just a minor procedure to relieve intracranial pressure. The doctor finally said with studied calm, "Nothing to worry about." "Strange," Sarah continued, feeling a surge of courage she hadn't known she possessed, "because I consulted a neurosurgeon yesterday. I showed him pictures of the scar. He said it looks like the result of an experimental procedure called deep brain stimulation, used to suppress motor functions." Elizabeth's face drained of all color. "You had no authority to consult other doctors about Josh," she snapped, her voice trembling slightly. "That's a violation of your contract. Just like keeping a teenager artificially paralyzed is a violation of every ethical and medical law," Sarah countered, her eyes never leaving Dr. Phillips. The doctor took a step forward, his mask of professionalism beginning to crack. "Miss Miller, you don't understand what you're getting yourself into. I suggest you—" The door swung open. Martha entered, followed by two men in suits and a middle-aged woman with a badge visible on her belt. "Detective Laura Harris." The woman introduced herself. "We have a warrant to investigate allegations of medical negligence and possible abuse against a minor, Josh Thompson." The chaos that followed was like a storm contained within those walls. Elizabeth screamed about property invasion. Dr. Phillips demanded to speak to his lawyer, while investigators began collecting medical supplies and documents. Sarah remained beside Josh, holding his hand, feeling his fingers tighten around hers with a strength that seemed impossible just days ago. "It's going to be okay now," she whispered. "No!" A voice thundered from the doorway. Richard Thompson stood there, his face contorted in cold fury. "Nothing is going to be okay." He took a step toward the bed, but investigators immediately restrained him. "Richard Thompson, we have questions regarding your nephew's current medical condition, as well as the whereabouts of Meredith Thompson," the detective stated. "Nephew?" Richard let out a harsh laugh. "Josh is my son with Meredith." The revelation struck like lightning in the silent room. Suddenly, everything made a terrible kind of sense. Why Richard had killed his own brother, why he kept Meredith isolated, why he controlled Josh so fiercely. It wasn't just about inheritance. It was something deeper, more disturbing. A family secret that threatened to unearth decades of lies. Amidst the uproar, a new figure appeared in the doorway, accompanied by Claire. a pale, frail woman, but with the same amber eyes as Josh. Meredith Thompson, finally free from her confinement, looked directly at the son she had not seen in years, her expression a mixture of pain and love that swept through the room like a physical force. "Josh," she whispered, stepping forward cautiously, as if afraid he might disappear. And then, for the first time in 8 months, Josh Thompson moved his lips and formed a single word, his voice hoarse and disuse, but perfectly clear. "Mom." The room seemed frozen in time as years of lies dissolved like mist under the sun. Meredith, with trembling steps, approached her son's bed. Her hands, marked by years of forced medication, gently touched Josh's face. "My boy," she whispered, tears flowing freely. "Every day, even drugged, I thought of you." Sarah stepped back, giving them space. Richard remained restrained by the investigators, his face a mask of rage. Elizabeth had vanished in the commotion, and Dr. Phillips was being questioned in the hallway. "He killed William," Meredith said, her eyes never leaving her son. "Your Uncle William found out everything, that Josh was Richard's son, not his." Claire stepped closer to Sarah. "William loved Josh as his own. When he discovered the truth, he still decided to leave everything to the boy. That Richard could not accept. And he made Josh disappear too," Sarah added, feeling a shiver run through her. Josh, with visible effort, lifted his hand to touch his mother's face. His fingers traced the contours of her tears. The gesture held all the love and pain that words could never express. "Mrs. Thompson, the detective called. We need your formal statement, and we need to arrange for a full medical evaluation of your son." Meredith nodded, reluctant to step away. "I won't leave him alone again." "You won't," Sarah assured her. "I'll be with him the whole time." In the hallway, the commotion continued, Richard being taken away, Dr. Phillips looking pale against the wall, Martha weeping quietly. When everyone left, except for Sarah and Josh, a different silence filled the room. Not the oppressive silence of secrecy, but the light silence of truth revealed. "It's over," Sarah whispered. "They can't hurt you anymore." Josh moved his lips, struggling to form words. Sarah leaned in to hear. "Why, you knew," he whispered, every word costing immense effort. "When no one else—" "I saw you," she replied simply. "I saw beyond what they wanted everyone to believe." A sudden movement at the door made Sarah turn. Elizabeth stood there, red-eyed, her face contorted. In her hand, a syringe gleamed. "He can't testify," Elizabeth said, unnervingly calm. "If Josh speaks, everything ends." Sarah stepped between her and the bed. "Elizabeth, it's over. Investigators are everywhere. Richard is being taken away. There's no more hiding the truth." "There's always a way," Elizabeth said, stepping forward. "Richard took care of William. I took care of Meredith for years. And now—" The movement was swift. Elizabeth lunged toward the bed. Sarah grabbed her wrist, and the two women crashed to the floor, struggling desperately. "Josh!" Sarah yelled, "Call for help." With superhuman effort, Josh reached the emergency button. The alarm blared through the house as the women fought. The syringe flew from Elizabeth's hand just as Sarah managed to pin her down. Footsteps rushed in the hallway. The detective and her team burst into the room, quickly restraining Elizabeth, who now sobbed uncontrollably. Beside the bed, Josh watched everything with newfound clarity. "Sarah," he said, his voice weak but determined, "thank you for listening to my silence." 3 months passed like pages turning slowly, each day bringing small victories that, together, formed a miracle. The rehabilitation hospital, with its soft-colored walls and windows that welcomed the sunlight, became the setting for a quiet rebirth. Sarah watched Josh sitting in a wheelchair by the window, his fingers now moving with increasing dexterity over a sketchbook. Each week, his strokes became more firm, just like his voice, which was gradually finding its way back after so many months of imposed silence. "I managed to move my toes this morning," Josh said, without taking his eyes off his drawing. There was a serene determination in him that Sarah deeply admired. Not even the worst of traumas had managed to extinguish that inner light. "That's wonderful," Sarah replied, sitting beside him. Their daily meetings, even after she was no longer his official nurse, had become an anchor for both of them. The drawing was taking shape under his fingers. A family, Josh, Meredith, and Claire holding hands, with a bird flying freely above them. And, standing a bit apart, but clearly part of the picture, was Sarah's figure watching over that small, rebuilt family. "Will you be there tomorrow?" Josh finally asked, lifting his gaze to her. "At the trial?" Sarah nodded, covering his hand with hers. "I'll always be where you need me to be." The courtroom had become the stage where the truth, after being silenced for so long, was finally given a voice. Richard and Dr. Phillips faced serious charges, ranging from medical negligence to attempted homicide. Elizabeth had struck a deal with the prosecution, her testimony crucial in unraveling the full extent of the conspiracy. Meredith entered the rehabilitation center carrying the soft scent of fresh flowers. Every day, she seemed to recover a little more the woman she had once been. Still fragile, but with inner strength that had survived years of forced medication and isolation. "Claire is waiting in the car," she said, kissing her son's forehead. "Are you ready to go home?" Home, a word that had taken on an entirely new meaning. No longer the Thompson mansion, with its dark secrets and oppressive corridors, but the small apartment that the two sisters now shared, transforming it, day by day, into a refuge of light and truth. "Almost," Josh replied, finishing the last details of his drawing. Then he handed it to Sarah. "For you, so you won't forget." "As if I ever could," she whispered, feeling a lump form in her throat as she looked at that simple piece of paper that carried so much meaning. "You saved more than my life," Josh continued, his words carrying the weight of a profound truth. "You saved my voice, my story." On the way to the parking lot, Josh insisted on taking a few steps on his own, supported by Sarah and Meredith. Each small movement was a victory over the past, a statement that not even the most elaborate plan to silence him had been able to erase his essence. "The lawyer says Richard might get life in prison," Meredith commented as they helped Josh into the car. "But no sentence will ever make up for the years we lost." "We can't get back the past," Sarah replied, adjusting Josh's seatbelt. "But the future is entirely in your hands now." As the car drove away, Sarah stood in the parking lot, watching it disappear into the distance. Her phone vibrated, a message from the clinic where she had returned to work. After refusing Claire's generous financial offer, "Some gifts have no price," Sarah had explained. "What I experienced with Josh is one of them." The next day, the courtroom was packed. Sarah sat in the second row, her heart racing as she watched Josh enter in his wheelchair, flanked by Meredith and Claire. In his eyes, there was no longer the emptiness that had haunted her on that first day at the Thompson mansion, but serene clarity that spoke of pain overcome and hope renewed. Richard entered under guard, his gaze instinctively searching for his son. For a brief moment, something resembling regret flickered across his face, but it was quickly replaced by the mask of arrogance he had always worn as a shield. When Josh was called to testify, a thick silence filled the room. With a voice still weak but firm, he told his story, the accident he had witnessed, the suspicions he had begun to have, how he had been gradually silenced. "He was my biological father," Josh said, looking directly at Richard, "but he was never really my dad." The words, simple and devastating, closed a chapter of betrayal, greed, and manipulation that had nearly destroyed so many lives. But they also marked the beginning of another, a story of healing, truth, and rebuilding. Months later, as the leaves began to turn red and gold, Sarah received an invitation for dinner at the family's new home. Josh now walked a cane, his body regaining strength day by day. Meredith had returned to painting, her artistic talent blossoming again like a flower after a long winter. Claire managed a family business, transforming the Thompson empire into something that William would have approved of. "I'm going back to school next semester," Josh announced during dinner, his voice now stronger, more confident. "And after that, I want to study medicine." "Medicine?" Sarah smiled, a wave of pride warming her chest. "I want to help people the way you helped me," he explained, his eyes shining with quiet determination. "I want to learn how to listen to the silence of others." That night, walking back to her apartment under a starry sky, Sarah thought about how fate intertwines in unexpected ways. She had entered that dark mansion looking for nothing more than a job, a way to survive. She had left transformed, having found a family in the most unlikely places, having learned that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply listening when everyone else chooses to ignore. Silence, she had discovered, is never truly empty. It is full of truths waiting to be heard by those brave enough to listen. If you enjoyed this emotional and intense story, don't forget to leave your opinion in the comments. Your feedback helps us create more content that touches the heart. Give us a like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next stories of overcoming obstacles, revealed truths, and deep connections. See you in the next story.